It's been a few hours since my last video on ACMA's proposal to change the arrangements for amateur licences in Australia. And there's been a big reaction already. There were also a few loose ends from the last video that I didn't have time to put in. So here's a video that covers some of those loose ends, some early reaction, and where to from here. I'll talk about how things are done overseas. That might help inform your submission. Also some of the past record where the idea of a class license has come up for amateur radio in Australia, and in previous times it hasn't got up, and there's been quite a bit of opposition to it. I'll explain that in a bit more detail later on. Then I'll talk about something that I mentioned in passing, the operating procedure manual, which is something that the amateur community will need to develop in conjunction with ACMA. That is if we get option B, which is the apparatus license but with fewer regulations, or option C, which is the class license they propose. And finally, I'll talk about leadership in amateur radio if we're ever going to get the conditions that we want and are best for us in the future. What is being proposed here is not revolutionary when you consider license conditions for amateurs in some other countries. Here with New Zealand, they have a general user radio license. That seems to be a lot like our class license, but with a wider scope. For instance, it covers CB, cordless phones, low power transmitters, aeronautical, amateur and more. When you look at the amateur conditions, there's a separate document called an Amateur Radio Operator GURL, and that includes no individual licenses, no annual fees, but you still must be a qualified operator with a call sign. Beacons and repeaters, though, remain individually licensed with a fee. Another thing I noticed about New Zealand is their amateur license conditions seem to be a lot simpler than ours. Just 6 pages, and that includes the list of frequencies and bands. In relation to exams, approved examiners conduct exams, issue certificates, and issue call signs. It all seems to be a fairly streamlined process, with the call sign data going onto the RSM website so people can look up details. In relation to the administration of amateur exams, it seems to be the NZART who does it, and exams are very cheap at $5. But the big sting is that initial call sign issue costs $95, so $100 all up, but they do only have one license level. Another thing is that students under 25 can become an amateur for nothing. In the UK, they have amateurs on their radio communication licence. They call it licence for life, but you do need to revalidate every 5 years. And there are no annual fees in most cases. Their amateur licence conditions are a bit longer though, at 26 pages. As for exams, their exam fees are around £30 each, increasing with the licence level. That's administered through the RSGB. In Canada, they abolished their need for a station licence more than 20 years ago. Now they only need an amateur operator licence, and there's no annual fee. Neither is there an annual renewal, but you must advise address changes. There's no fee for a certificate or initial call sign, making the Canadian system very cheap to become an amateur for. Fees exist for a few things, but they are rare. And exam fees are very low as well. The same applies in the US with $15 exam fees, with the exam system administered by volunteer exam coordinator bodies. They did abolish call sign application and licence fees, but are bringing them back. But it's a relatively modest fee, $35 for issue, and for a renewal that lasts for 10 years. If your details change, then you need to update them via FCC's ULS database. Hopefully that was useful in helping you form your view. The New Zealand arrangement seems to be most similar to what ACMA proposed with the class licence, that is option C. Now, class licensing has been an issue not just recently, but for the better part of 25 years, when class licences were first put in. That's when we had the structure of spectrum licences, apparatus licences and class licences, with the big users paying a spectrum access tax, particularly for the highly sought after UHF and microwave bands. This was when telecommunication, and particularly mobile telecommunication, was really expanding, and spectrum auctions were all the go. I wanted to bring that up because in late 94-95 there was a plan to increase amateur licence fees from around $35, $37 to around $70, so about a doubling. And there was a big campaign. There was amateurs, some were pushing for fee-free licences. I know that Ian VK3YE was very active in that. And whereas there are others, like the WIA, that was advocating more a reduced licence fee, which is what we got in the end. The licence fee increase was nowhere near as sharp, and we ended up with a fee of around $50. And surprisingly, more than 20 years later, that's where our apparatus licence fee still is for amateurs. So it's hardly gone up at all. The arguments raised back then were similar to now, in that if we were to take out a class licence, we wouldn't have protection against interference, and our hold of the bands would be less secure, with other licence categories, like apparatus or even spectrum, having greater privileges than us. Something else I should mention is that there was a campaign about 5 years ago for amateurs to go to a class licence, and it was obviously significant enough for the WIA to make some public comments about, and I'll just show you what was in the November 2015 Amateur Radio magazine in the President's comment, where the President at the time, Phil Waite, basically said that although a class licence with no fee was superficially attractive, if you paid nothing, you get nothing. So there would be potentially less service from ACMA in relation to things like interference. And that was backed up by a letter to the editor from Dale Hughes, VK1DSH. And Dale is very experienced on the international representation side in spectrum planning. So there are some fairly strong views from WIA circles that we would be better off with a fee-paying apparatus licence back around 5 or 6 years ago. As for the WIA position now, we haven't heard yet, but no doubt that will become apparent in the near future. Something else I wanted to mention was the operating procedure manual. ACMA basically are all about deregulating and reducing regulations, and if there are regulations at all, just putting it back onto the users rather than specifying things itself. So in both option B, which was the apparatus licence with fewer regulations, and option C, which is the class licence, there is going to be an amateur operation manual that was going to be voluntarily observed, but it was something basically for the guidance of those getting their amateur qualification. The idea with that was that amateurs would have to cooperate with ACMA to help develop it. Now, does that sound familiar? It should do, because not long ago there is a proposal for there to be a syllabus panel, amateur syllabus panel, and they were going to look at the syllabus for the various levels of amateur exam and to try and hammer out something that was suitable. Anyway, that involved various amateur representatives and the Australian Maritime College, but in the end it failed. There was basically squabbles between the various groups within amateur radio. ACMA were not happy at all that it failed, and so they ended up by taking on that responsibility back themselves. And if you compare ACMA's deregulatory trend, that relies on industry to be mature and to work out its own arrangements, but the fiasco with the syllabus review panel meant that amateurs couldn't be trusted for this sort of self-regulation. So this amateur operating manual is another chance that ACMA is potentially giving us to find agreement and to come up with something that's acceptable for amateurs. And it might mean having to put aside various petty rivalries and jealousies. But ACMA are very eager for amateurs to be mature enough to do that. And that requires leadership, as does leadership on this matter more generally. A lot of amateurs, and I've received phone calls on this, emails already, and it's only been a few hours, are really passionate about this. They are very strongly of the view that we must keep the apparatus license system. If we don't keep that, and if they make it a fee-free license system, then we lose a lot of the protections that we have. Even if they're not very great, we would like more service from ACMA. It is thought that the protections we have and that we are paying customers are better than nothing. Now, if you looked at the material that I referred you to, ACMA are very much intent on favouring the class license structure. The only way you're going to not get that is for amateurs to be united. And that requires leadership, not just one organisation or another, but all the amateurs have got to be united. If you don't want apparatus licensing to be removed, if you don't want us to be a class license, if you want to maintain even a modicum of service, then the only way you're going to convince ACMA that that's the way forward is for all amateurs to have a consensus. And that includes amateur groups, associations, and those who claim to represent us. So that's really important. It's a big issue facing amateur radio in Australia, and if there's a time for petty jealousies, rivalries, backbiting, that's not the time. We've got to get this done properly and get a good regulatory framework for amateurs to carry us forward. And if you are in a position of leadership, try and get amateurs together, not split us apart, even if that means making up with people that might have previously been your rivals. In this, amateurs are all in this together, and we've got to get a good outcome.